The boy's eyes were wide, haunted, as he listened to his father's cold decree. "He's been poisoned against you by that Winters fellow and the runaway girl," Samuel Ruttled said, his voice carved from stone. "He needs to be sent away, where he can be supervised, re-educated." Thomas's stomach churned. The Virginia Military Academy his father had in mind specialized in breaking rebellious young men, forging them into obedient sons of the South. But Thomas had already tasted rebellion. Before his father could act, a message arrived, carried by a free black carter who traveled between Charleston and the rural plantations. The message was coded, but Thomas understood immediately. Ruby was alive. She needed him. She asked for copies of his journal entries, the ones detailing the night of the mysterious patient's death. Thomas faced a choice: comply, destroy the journal and preserve his safety, or commit fully to the rebellion he had begun, risking everything he knew. Over 3 nights, working by flickering candlelight, Thomas copied 23 pages of his journal. Each entry captured the fear, the injustice, the horrifying details adults had worked to suppress. The night Ruby had screamed into the house, his confrontation with Dutch Calloway and her desperate escape. His handwriting was still childish, forming uneven letters, yet every word radiated truth. On the 4th night, he picked his locked door with a stolen hairpin and met the carter near the edge of the property. He handed over the wrapped pages and whispered a message. "Tell her I'm sorry I couldn't do more. Tell her I believe her." The carter disappeared into the darkness, and Thomas returned to his room, heart-pounding, aware that nothing could undo what he had done. What Thomas didn't know was that Dutch Calloway had been watching. The overseer saw the exchange and smiled grimly. Evidence of conspiracy with abolitionists, exactly the pretext he needed to tighten the noose. At dawn, Samuel Ruttled summoned Thomas and 2 men he didn't recognize, hired muscle from Charleston. They tore through Thomas's room, uncovering the journal hidden beneath the floorboards. Samuel's face was impassive as he read, eyes void of love, only calculation. "You've betrayed your family, your class, your people," he said. "I told the truth. Your truth is treason." He handed the journal to Calloway. "Burn it, all of it." Thomas lunged, but the men held him fast. Outside, the journal crackled in the fire, months of careful documentation reduced to smoke. But Thomas's copied pages survived. Weeks later, they would reach Ruby in Philadelphia, forming the basis of a confession letter that would endure long after the plantation walls crumbled. Thomas's choice had been irreversible. The world he knew, the one of power, fear, and secrets, was fracturing, and for the first time he had chosen the side of truth. Thomas's rebellion had set forces in motion he could neither control nor fully foresee. 6 months later, he found himself at Braxton Military Academy in Virginia, a grim institution designed to break the spirits of boys like him. The brick walls were imposing, the drills relentless, and the punishments brutal. But Thomas had learned endurance, and in his heart burned a determination no academy could extinguish. One night, a wounded figure collapsed near the stables. The groom who found her called the infirmary, and Thomas, assigned to stable duty as punishment for insubordination, rushed forward. The girl's dark eyes opened just long enough to register recognition. Ruby, the same girl whose safety he had risked everything to ensure. "My father sent me after I gave your testimony to the abolitionists," she whispered through cracked lips. "They're coming for me." Thomas's jaw set. "Then we don't run, we fight back." He explained the truth to Ruby. The Academy's commandant, Marcus Wellesley, a stern Union Army veteran, had spoken critically of slavery and might offer protection. Ruby, terrified and exhausted, was skeptical, but Thomas's conviction left little room for doubt. Together, they went to Wellesley, Thomas presenting their case with the courage of someone hardened beyond his years. "A fugitive enslaved girl is in our infirmary," he said, his voice steady despite his 10-year-old frame. "She witnessed a murder at my father's plantation. I have documentation of that event and the conspiracy that followed. A slave catcher named Silas Crenshaw intends to return her. I'm asking you to protect her." Wellesley studied him carefully. Thomas had arrived 6 months prior with a reputation for trouble, yet there was something in his posture, the way he spoke, that suggested truthfulness, integrity, and an understanding beyond his years. "Bring me the documentation," Wellesley said. Thomas had no original journal, the fire had destroyed it, but over the next 3 hours he recounted key passages from memory. Ruby, once strong enough, added her testimony. Her voice, clear and unwavering, described the night in the barn, the staged attack, and the terror she had endured. Every word struck a chord of undeniable truth. When Crenshaw arrived with forged papers and legal authority to reclaim Ruby, he was met not with compliance but defiance. Wellesley, backed by 6 armed instructors, refused to hand her over. "You may have the law on your side, Mr. Crenshaw, but the moral right is on hers," he declared. The slave catcher left foiled for now. Over the following weeks, Wellesley used his military and social connections to bring attention to Ruby's case. He ensured that her testimony, combined with Thomas's recollections, was documented by multiple witnesses. Pressure mounted on Virginia authorities to investigate Magnolia Ridge anew. Enslaved workers, sensing protection, began speaking openly about Dutch Calloway's brutality and Samuel Ruttle's complicity. Even Margaret Ruttle came forward, producing her secret journal detailing her doubts, her guilt, and the false narrative she had once helped maintain. The combined weight of these testimonies exposed the conspiracy to silence and manipulate the truth. The stage was set for justice, however imperfect, and for a young boy and a frightened girl to confront the cruelty that had shaped their lives. The legal consequences of the revelations at Magnolia Ridge began to unfold slowly but inexorably. Dutch Calloway, the overseer whose cruelty had haunted Thomas and Ruby, attempted to flee South Carolina. Federal marshals intercepted him in Alabama, bringing him back to face charges, though the courts, wary of a scandal that might implicate prominent plantation families, compromised with a manslaughter conviction. Sentenced to 7 years, he served only 4 before dying of pneumonia in a Georgia penitentiary. Justice, though delayed and partial, had caught up with him. Samuel Ruttle, burdened by guilt and debt, suffered what doctors called an apoplexy, though many suspected it was the weight of conscience that finally brought him down. He sold Magnolia Ridge in 1837, dying 2 years later, broken in body and reputation. Margaret Ruttle, seeking a measure of atonement, used part of the sale proceeds to legally manumit Ruby, ensuring her freedom. It was a small act, but one that brought closure to a life shadowed by complicity and fear. Thomas Ruttle, hardened by his experiences and strengthened by the moral courage that had guided him since childhood, completed his education at Braxton Military Academy. Later, he attended university in Pennsylvania, where he became active in the abolitionist movement, dedicating his life to defending formerly enslaved people and exposing the injustices he had witnessed firsthand. Ruby and Thomas maintained correspondence, their shared trauma forging a bond of trust, respect, and unspoken understanding. The story's final chapter unfolded 12 years later in 1846, when Ruby, now a free woman of 20, returned to Magnolia Ridge as the plantation manor was being demolished. Accompanied by Thomas, she carried a completed account of her mother's murder, combining her testimony Thomas's journal excerpts, and Margaret Ruttle's confessional writings. Together, they created what would become known as the Confession Letter. Sealed in oilcloth and hidden in the manor walls, it preserved the truth for posterity, surviving the destruction and deceit that had long threatened to bury it. When the letter was discovered in 1847, the Charleston Historical Society initially attempted to suppress it, just as authorities had tried to suppress the original testimonies. Yet copies had been circulated through abolitionist networks, and the story became a powerful piece of evidence against the moral and legal corruption of the slave system. Ruby lived to see the end of the Civil War and the abolition of slavery, dying in 1891 at the age of 65, surrounded by the descendants her mother had never met. Thomas, a lawyer specializing in cases for formerly enslaved people, spent his career trying to atone for his father's sins. Margaret Ruttle dedicated her later years to operating a school for freed black children, a personal act of penance and education for the next generation. The barn where Patience Drummond had died was torn down in 1848, and local legend claimed the ground there never grew properly again, an eerie reminder of the violence that had taken place. Yet the story of Ruby, Thomas, and the courage of truth endured, showing that even when power, law, and fear conspire to bury the facts, justice, however delayed, can survive. Patience, persistence, and moral courage ensured that the darkness of Magnolia Ridge could not remain hidden forever. The confession letter, once a secret act of preservation, became a testament. The truth cannot be extinguished. Even after justice had been partially served and Ruby's freedom secured, the echoes of Magnolia Ridge lingered in every life it had touched. The trauma, the secrets, and the courage displayed in those dark years became a part of each survivor's soul. Ruby, now a young woman in Philadelphia, continued to heal, not just from the physical threats she had endured, but from the psychological scars left by a world that had treated her as less than human. She dedicated herself to education, teaching other formerly enslaved children to read and write, knowing that literacy was not just knowledge, but power, a shield against oppression. Thomas Ruttle, carrying the weight of guilt for his father's actions, found a calling in advocacy. His career as a lawyer defending the rights of formerly enslaved people became more than profession. It was penance and purpose combined. Each case he took was informed by the memory of Ruby, the injustices at Magnolia Ridge, and the journal he had once copied in secret. His childhood rebellion against his father's authority had grown into a lifelong pursuit of justice, one that sought to dismantle the same systems that had nearly destroyed both Ruby and himself. Margaret Ruttle, who had once been complicit in maintaining the false narrative to protect her family, transformed her remorse into tangible action. The school she operated in Charleston for freed black children was more than education, it was redemption. Each lesson she imparted, each child she nurtured, was a quiet act of contrition, an acknowledgement that complicity must be met with change. She lived her final years quietly, yet with a sense of purpose that had eluded her in youth. The confession letter, hidden in the manor walls, became a symbol that truth, no matter how suppressed, can endure. Its discovery by historians in 1847 revealed not only the facts of one horrific night, but the broader injustice of a society willing to excuse cruelty to maintain its own comfort and wealth. The letter circulated among abolitionists, strengthening the moral arguments against slavery and providing an unassailable example of courage in the face of systemic oppression. Yet even as the story was recorded and remembered, whispers persisted in South Carolina about what had been lost to time. Some claimed other letters, journals, or confessions had been destroyed or hidden, suggesting that Magnolia Ridge still held secrets waiting to surface. It was a reminder that history is often incomplete, shaped by those with power to write or erase it. For Ruby and Thomas, the experiences at Magnolia Ridge forged an unbreakable bond. Their friendship, built on shared trauma, mutual trust, and the pursuit of justice, endured for decades. Together, they ensured that the horrors of their childhood would serve as lessons for generations to come, a testament to the necessity of courage, truth, and moral vigilance. The land where Magnolia Ridge once stood became quiet, its fields returning slowly to nature. But the story of what had occurred there, preserved in letters, journals, and memory, ensured that the darkness would not be forgotten. It served as a stark warning. Systems built on oppression may hide their crimes, but those who witness and speak the truth hold the power to illuminate even the darkest corners of history. Even in the years that followed, the tale of Ruby Drummond, Thomas Ruttled, and the confession letter endured, a legacy of courage, defiance, and the unyielding quest for justice. The horrors of the past were never erased, but they were remembered, honored, and ultimately transformed into lessons for the future. Years later, long after the ruins of Magnolia Ridge had been swallowed by time and the landscape had begun to reclaim what had been torn from it, the memories of that place lingered like a shadow over those who had survived its horrors. Ruby Drummond, now a woman of quiet strength and measured resolve, often walked the streets of Philadelphia, teaching, writing, and advocating for those whose voices were too long silenced. Every lesson she imparted, every story she shared, carried the weight of her past, a reminder that courage was born in the darkest hours. Thomas Ruttled, having dedicated his life to law and justice, found solace only in action. He carried the memory of Magnolia Ridge not as a burden, but as a compass. Each case he took, defending the rights of the oppressed, was a direct challenge to the system his father had upheld. He and Ruby corresponded faithfully, sharing both victories and setbacks, bound by a shared history that neither distance nor time could sever. Their bond had transformed from childhood friendship into an enduring partnership in the fight against injustice. Margaret Ruttled lived quietly in Charleston, tending her school for freed children. She had learned, too late perhaps, that complicity in evil demanded accountability. Yet in her final years, she found a measure of redemption in education and care, nurturing the next generation to think, question, and challenge what had once been taken for granted. In her journals, she reflected endlessly on the fragile nature of morality and the courage it took to defy the expectations of one's class, one's family, and one's society. The confession letter, that fragile testament of truth and courage, survived the passage of years as if protected by the very justice it chronicled. When discovered, it ignited debates, inspired writings, and became a rallying point for abolitionists who recognized that the fight against oppression was not merely legal, but moral. Its existence proved that even the most powerful forces could not completely erase the voices of those who refused to be silenced. Yet, beneath the triumphs and reconciliations, a haunting truth remained. The darkness of Magnolia Ridge had not been entirely exorcised. The land remembered, the walls remembered, and history, even when it revealed the truth, bore the traces of what had been lost to fear, power, and cruelty. It was a reminder that vigilance, compassion, and courage must be passed forward, lest the horrors of the past repeat themselves. Ruby and Thomas often reflected on how a single act of defiance, writing, remembering, risking everything, had changed the course of their lives and challenged the machinery of oppression. Their story, rooted in trauma but flowering in courage, stood as a testament. The smallest voice, preserved and shared, could become a force of lasting change. As the sun set over the fields that had once been Magnolia Ridge, the wind carried whispers of the past. not of cruelty nor of despair, but of resistance, truth, and the unwavering human spirit. And in that lingering echo, one could almost hear the promise that even in the darkest corners of history, light, fragile, persistent, and undeniable, would endure. The story of Ruby Drummond, Thomas Ruttled, and the confession letter reminds us that history belongs not only to those who wield power, but to those who dare to speak, document, and act. Their legacy is not just survival. It is defiance, witness, and the enduring courage to tell the truth. Decades later, long after Ruby Drummond and Thomas Ruttled had passed from the world, their story continued to ripple through the communities they had touched. Ruby's writings, preserved in libraries and archives, became a cornerstone for historians seeking to understand the human cost of slavery, not only in the lives lost, but in the courage it demanded to speak the truth. Thomas's legal papers, full of case notes and personal reflections, offered insight into a man who had refused to inherit the moral compromises of his lineage. Together, their lives became an unexpected bridge between worlds, one of privilege and one of oppression, forever intertwined by the choices of childhood. The land of Magnolia Ridge, once a place of terror and secrecy, gradually returned to nature. New buildings rose, fields were replanted, but locals still whispered of the old barn where Patience Drummond had died. Stories passed down spoke of a strange quiet in the soil, a subtle reminder that some histories cannot be buried, no matter how thoroughly the walls crumble. Archaeologists and historians, following fragments of diaries and the recovered confession letter, pieced together events that were once hidden, revealing the interconnected acts of bravery that had defied the system. In Charleston, the descendants of those once enslaved at Magnolia Ridge carried Ruby's legacy in subtle ways, through education, storytelling, and the careful preservation of family histories that had survived against the odds. In Pennsylvania, Thomas's legal victories inspired generations of young lawyers to consider justice not as a profession, but as a moral imperative. Communities slowly stitched together the threads of truth that had once been violently torn apart, finding resilience in the endurance of testimony. The confession letter, long considered a historical artifact, became a symbol beyond its immediate story. Exhibits displayed it alongside narratives of courage, resistance, and the complex choices faced by those living within oppressive systems. Visitors marveled at the childish handwriting of Thomas and the mature, resolute script of Ruby, recognizing in them the duality of innocence and experience, fear and courage, silence and testimony. It was a reminder that even the smallest voices, when recorded and preserved, could reverberate far beyond their origin. Yet the story also served as a cautionary tale. Power, unchecked and unchallenged, leaves scars that outlive the individuals who wield it. Samuel Ruttle's ruin, Dutch Calloway's brief imprisonment, and the partial justice of the courts revealed the limits of societal and legal accountability. True justice, it seemed, required persistence, witness, and the unflinching courage to act when laws fail. Ruby and Thomas had provided that courage, but the story reminded all who learned it that moral responsibility does not expire with age, status, or even death. And so the legacy of Magnolia Ridge endured, not as a place of shame, but as a testament to the resilience of truth. The actions of a 10-year-old boy risking his safety to record what he saw, of a young girl who refused to be silenced despite unimaginable danger, and of those who finally listened and acted, showed that history is never wholly owned by the powerful. It belongs to those brave enough to remember, to document, and to speak. In the quiet of libraries, in the classrooms of freed children, in the letters exchanged across decades, the story whispered on, a reminder that even in the darkest chapters of human cruelty, light can survive. And in that light, future generations could learn not only the horrors of the past, but the courage required to confront them. Years after Ruby Drummond and Thomas Ruddled had gone their separate ways, the echoes of their childhood choices continued to reverberate through the generations. In Philadelphia, Ruby had married and raised a family, instilling in her children the values of resilience, justice, and the power of testimony. She often told them stories of courage, carefully shaping memories of the past into lessons for the future. In her home, the confession letter remained preserved, a relic of a time when speaking the truth could have meant death. It was a reminder of the price of honesty and of the extraordinary bravery required to defy an unjust system. Thomas, having completed his legal education, dedicated his life to advocating for those denied justice. Each case he took up reminded him of Magnolia Ridge, the violence he had witnessed, and the fragile hope embodied in Ruby's survival. While his father's name had been tarnished by scandal, Thomas worked to redeem not only his own conscience, but the possibility of fairness within the law itself. His correspondence with Ruby endured for decades, letters filled with shared memories, reflections on justice, and a deep understanding that their lives had been irrevocably shaped by that single summer of terror and courage. The ruins of Magnolia Ridge became a place of pilgrimage for historians, descendants, and students seeking to understand the complexities of human cruelty and resistance. The barn, where Patience Drummond had been murdered, remained long in the memories of locals, a haunting reminder that the legacies of violence are often buried in plain sight. Yet the hidden confession letter, discovered in 1847, transformed the narrative from one of suppression to one of revelation. It demonstrated that even in the face of overwhelming power, truth could endure, if only someone was willing to preserve it. Ruby and Thomas's story also underscored the importance of moral courage across divides. A young white boy from a family of enslavers risking punishment to document injustice, and a young black girl fighting for her life and her voice, had together created a record powerful enough to challenge entrenched systems of power. Their alliance, forged in the fires of trauma, demonstrated that change often begins in the most unlikely places and through the most unlikely partnerships. By the late 19th century, as the nation grappled with the legacy of slavery and the reality of Reconstruction, the tale of Magnolia Ridge became more than local lore. It served as a testament to human resilience and a warning about the consequences of moral compromise. Ruby's children and grandchildren carried forward the lessons she had imparted: the courage to speak, the determination to resist, and the necessity of preserving history even when it is inconvenient or dangerous. Thomas's work in law inspired others to see justice not merely as a concept, but as a responsibility. Ultimately, the story of Ruby Drummond, Thomas Ruddled, and the confessions hidden in the walls of Magnolia Ridge reminds us that history is never truly silent. Power can attempt to erase truth, the law can fail to protect it, and fear can attempt to suppress it. But witness, courage, and persistence have a way of surviving across time. In the quiet moments of reflection, in the preservation of letters and journals, and in the teaching of hard truths to future generations, the voices of the past continue to speak. Magnolia Ridge may have fallen to the ground, but the story of what happened there, and of the bravery it took to reveal it, lives on. It is a story that challenges us to remember, to bear witness, and to act. And as long as there are those willing to listen and preserve truth, the legacies of courage and defiance will never be lost. Decades later, the events at Magnolia Ridge had transformed from whispered local legend to a documented chapter in the history of resistance and courage. Ruby Drummond's voice, once silenced by fear and oppression, had endured through the pages of the confession letter, carried forward by those who believed in justice. Her story became a touchstone for historians and educators, a vivid reminder of the human cost of slavery and the resilience of those who dared to oppose it. Thomas Ruttle's life mirrored that of Ruby in many ways. Though he had been born into privilege, his childhood experiences forced him to confront moral choices that most men never had to consider. The shadow of his father's cruelty never fully left him, but it shaped him into a man determined to use the law not as a tool of oppression, but as a shield for the vulnerable. He fought tirelessly for formerly enslaved people, bringing cases that challenged systemic injustice and setting precedents that would echo long after his death. The legacy of their childhood rebellion went beyond personal triumph. Ruby's freedom, Thomas's advocacy, and Margaret Ruttle's quiet acts of penance all intersected to create a ripple effect. Communities in Charleston, Philadelphia, and beyond were subtly changed by the courage of a few determined individuals. The story of Magnolia Ridge highlighted not only the horrors of slavery but also the ways in which ordinary people, children, women, and even a rebellious boy could influence the course of justice. The confession letter, now preserved in historical archives, continues to inspire. Researchers and descendants alike study its contents, finding in it a reminder that truth, though suppressed, can never be fully destroyed. It serves as a moral compass, guiding future generations to recognize injustice and to act, even when the stakes are impossibly high. Ruby and Thomas, once children bound by trauma, had ensured that their voices could no longer be ignored, and yet the story leaves us with lingering questions. How many other voices were silenced, never to be recorded? How many truths were buried so deeply that even persistent historians cannot uncover them? Magnolia Ridge represents both the horrors of human cruelty and the hope that courage, documentation, and defiance can illuminate even the darkest corners of history. As we reflect on Ruby Drummond and Thomas Ruttle, we are reminded that history is not only about events, but about the people who lived them and the choices they made. It is about witnessing, remembering, and preserving. And while the plantation is gone, the lessons endure. Bravery can take root in the smallest of hearts. Moral courage can defy the strongest of oppressors. And truth, once spoken, has the power to echo across generations. The story of Magnolia Ridge is a testament to endurance, justice, and the unyielding pursuit of truth. It reminds us that even when history is buried under layers of power and fear, it can rise again, preserved in memory, written words, and the actions of those willing to confront injustice. Ruby and Thomas's lives, intertwined by fate and circumstance, continue to speak across time, urging us never to forget, never to remain silent, and always to act with conscience and courage. Years passed, but the shadow of Magnolia Ridge lingered in subtle ways. The plantation itself, demolished and replaced by modern structures, left behind little more than memories and the soil where countless secrets had been buried. Yet, for those who knew its story, the ones who had survived, documented, or witnessed its horrors, the legacy remained vivid, a haunting reminder of what had transpired. Ruby Drummond, now fully established in Philadelphia, continued her work as an educator and advocate for freed black children and women. She carried with her not only the trauma of her childhood, but the fierce determination that had allowed her to survive and speak out. Her life became a bridge between generations, linking the horrors of slavery to the ongoing struggle for equality and justice in the North. Every story she told, every student she guided, carried the imprint of Magnolia Ridge's lessons, courage in the face of oppression and the imperative of truth. Thomas Ruttle, meanwhile, grew into a man whose very identity was shaped by the moral battles of his youth. His father's cruelty and his own choices at Braxton Academy had instilled in him an unshakable sense of justice. As a lawyer, He sought cases that challenged the lingering vestiges of slavery and inequality, defending those whom society had long overlooked. He remained in correspondence with Ruby, their bond forged in childhood trauma and reinforced by a shared commitment to justice. Together, they became symbols, not of revenge, but of accountability and conscience. Margaret Rutland, having purchased Ruby's freedom, also carved a path toward redemption. Her later years were spent educating freed black children in Charleston, quietly atoning for her earlier complicity while instilling in her students the knowledge that history, no matter how dark, could be confronted and understood. In her journals, she wrote extensively about the moral reckoning that had consumed her family, leaving a record for future generations to examine, learn from, and remember. Even Dutch Calloway's brief and brutal notoriety served as a warning to others. His imprisonment and eventual death in Georgia underscored that unchecked cruelty could not endure forever, that legal and social forces, however imperfect, could occasionally intersect to prevent the worst excesses of power. The confession letter, hidden in the walls of the demolished manor and later discovered, became a historical artifact of extraordinary significance. Scholars, journalists, and educators treated it as a testament to resilience, courage, and the power of documentation. Through its pages, the voices of Ruby, Thomas, and Margaret spoke across decades, demanding recognition of truths once suppressed by wealth, influence, and fear. Magnolia Ridge may have been destroyed, but its story endured. It reminded all who encountered it that the past, no matter how deeply buried, cannot be erased when courage and conscience preserve it. The legacies of those who survived, of children who dared to speak, of adults who sought justice, and of those willing to confront their own complicity, remained potent symbols of resistance, moral fortitude, and the enduring human desire to set things right. History, in the end, remembered, and in remembering, it gave hope to those who came after, proving that even in the darkest chapters, truth has the power to survive and to transform the world. By the mid-19th century, the echoes of Magnolia Ridge had spread far beyond the confines of South Carolina. Ruby Drummond's courage, Thomas Rutled's conscience, and Margaret Rutled's atonement had combined to create a narrative that would inspire abolitionists, historians, and ordinary people who sought truth in a world that often preferred lies. The confession letter, preserved against the odds, became more than a document. It was a symbol of resilience, moral clarity, and the enduring fight for justice. Ruby, now in her 20s, dedicated her life to education and advocacy. She frequently spoke at abolitionist gatherings in Philadelphia, using her story to illuminate the horrors that enslaved people endured and the systemic corruption that allowed such crimes to remain hidden. Her voice, once silenced by chains and fear, became a tool for change, challenging others to confront uncomfortable truths. Each lecture, each encounter with a student or activist, carried the weight of the barn in which her mother had died and the courage of a 10-year-old girl who had refused to be erased. Thomas, shaped by his youth and the moral battles he had faced, continued his work as a lawyer defending those who society had long abandoned. He navigated courtrooms with precision, always guided by the principles that had compelled him to protect Ruby years earlier. The boy who had risked everything to copy a journal and defy his father had grown into a man whose life mission was justice. His correspondence with Ruby remained steadfast, their friendship evolving into a partnership in both legal advocacy and moral witness. Margaret Rutled's quiet redemption left its mark as well. Her school for freed black children became a sanctuary and a source of knowledge in Charleston, and her journals, once secret, were eventually published, offering historians an intimate glimpse into the conscience of a woman who had chosen to confront her complicity. Her writings reminded future generations that acknowledging guilt and seeking restitution, even in small ways, could create ripples of change. The story of Magnolia Ridge, once confined to whispers and fear, entered the public record and became part of the broader conversation about slavery, morality, and justice in America. The barn where Patience Drummond had died was gone, but the truths unearthed within those walls persisted. Scholars and activists cited the case as evidence that even in oppressive systems, courage and truth could survive. In the end, Magnolia Ridge became more than a plantation. It became a lesson. It showed that injustice, no matter how entrenched, is not invincible. It proved that children, even at 10 years old, could wield the power of conscience to challenge cruelty. It reminded the world that documents, testimony, and courage could pierce through generations of silence. Ruby, Thomas, and Margaret, each in their own way, ensured that the past was neither forgotten nor whitewashed. Their story stands as a testament. Truth has a way of surviving, even when buried beneath lies, oppression, and fire. And as long as those who encounter it remember and act, the shadows of the past can illuminate the path toward justice for the future.